All right, let's welcome into Straight Fire one of the foremost baseball authors, journalists in the space right now. And I knew him way back during the big league days. Mike Vacarro, New York Post. Mike, how are you, man?
Jason, I'm doing great. How are you doing today? Good to
Eh,
see you again.
Yeah, it's good to chat. We talked way back when I had this thing called a blog. I don't know if those are still a thing or not. And I
You
looked up to
invented it, I
you.
think. You invented it, I
Let's
think.
not go overboard.
I'm going to give you credit for that because
Uh,
it might have been the first one that I read. So there you go. I'll
Okay,
tell
I'll
you
take
that.
credit. Neil Best
That's it.
gave me some credit. He was like, because of your blog, I was able to get a Wikipedia page or
There you
something
go.
to that effect when he
All right,
retired. He told me.
sure.
But when I was in New York City, I was in like the entertainment space, and I was still a sports guy at heart. And Mike would just dominate the back page, and now he's doing stuff still on the back page, writing books. We're going to talk about his new book on the Yankees. Fun week for the Yankees. His book is The Boston's of the Bronx. We'll get to that. But Mike, you've been at the Post for a long time. Newspapers kind of, I don't know, they're in a weird space. I jumped out of them back in when I was working with Woj at the Bergen Record in like shucks 2002 3
Right.
because I was worried about this thing called the internet coming along. But here you
Yeah.
are still chugging along, and the New York Post is still dominating, breaking big stories and getting journalists fired. Well, I guess they fired themselves.
Well, you know what, Jason? It's funny. I actually looked up our interview that I did with you at the book league and on the big league 20 years ago. And it's funny, you said, do you think you'll stay in newspapers? It seems like everybody's jumping to the internet. And that was 20 years ago. So I'm either
Yeah.
way behind my time or I got lucky. And I think it's a little bit of both. Look, the Post is still one of the few newspapers left, certainly the sports section, that believes in covering our teams to the nth degree. I mean, we still travel. We still send multiple people on the road. I mean, Knicks are going to start the playoffs in Atlanta next week. We're going to have 3 and 4 people there. And it's a good bit of fortune for me that I seem to have picked the right horse.
Yeah. The New York sports backsliding a little. Yankees, not the team they were, I don't know, 20 years ago. My Jets, just a total train wreck. The Giants have
Wow,
fallen on hard times. Um, I guess the Knicks are the only salvation, but these are tough times in New York, no?
they are, and you're right. Everybody's kind of grabbing hold of the Knicks. I think the Mets and the Yankees are looking forward to the Knicks taking over the playoffs, so that
Yeah.
they can kind of struggle in anonymity. If the Knicks get eliminated from the playoffs too soon, all of a sudden people will turn to the baseball teams and say, "What's wrong
Good
here?"
point.
So they can kind of fly under the radar a little bit for now. But yeah, it's been a rough stretch. I mean, the other day, every now and again, I'll periodically write a column about the drought for the four main sports leagues, and it's something else. I mean, the Giants Super Bowl win in February of 2012 was the last time that we celebrated a championship around here.
Whoa.
Not counting the Liberty or the NYCFC and the MLS. I
Mm.
mean, but of the four main sports leagues, it's been a slog around here.
Yeah.
We get the Mets in the World Series once, the Yankees in the World Series once. We had a little bit of a prosperity with the Rangers and the Islanders, but not a lot. It's been a
Yeah.
pretty dry desert around here.
Do you think that's just a cyclical thing? I don't know. I mean, 13, well, I guess we're 14 years now. Well, maybe the Knicks can snap that here. But I don't know. Historically, I wonder that's probably the longest drought we've had in a while, right?
It's the longest drought they've ever had. Those four sports. If it
Whoa.
was only 6 years, I'd say maybe it's cyclical. But the fact that we're into our second decade of it makes you wonder what's really happening. And look, I mean, it's harder to win championships now than ever before in the sports, just because of the nature of surviving playoffs. So I suppose it's understandable. But you know what? The cities like Boston have figured it out. Los
Yeah.
Angeles has figured it out in multiple sports. So, and look, I mean, there was a time, back when you were at the Bergen Record and I was first starting out at the Star Ledger and going to the Post. I mean, our teams regularly, multiple teams would go to the finals of
Yeah.
their leagues, and it's been a long stretch.
I wonder, is that a lot of analytics? We seem to know more about the sports now. Maybe New York isn't the destination for free agency at once. What I don't know. I mean, I'm sure somebody will do a deep dive into that, but it
I
definitely
think that's
feels strange.
I think that's one of it. Look, and I think one of the things, look, there's always been this fascination with, why didn't LeBron James ever want to play here? Well, because he didn't have to play here. He could love New
Mm.
York. He could pay homage to New York twice a year, or when he was in the East Conference, 4 times a year, and then go. And LeBron James can be a marketing kingdom all by himself, whether he lives in Los Angeles and Cleveland and Akron or in Toledo. He doesn't need New York the way athletes back in the '70s and '80s.
Mm.
When Joe Willie Namath became a Madison Avenue icon, as in, Clyde Frazier and Tom Seaver and the others. It was the proximity to Madison Avenue that really drew them. And look, I mean, we're going to talk about this book soon enough. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Reggie Jackson came to New York. He didn't come to New York because they offered him the most money. They didn't, but they offered him New York City and all of that meant. And Reggie was savvy enough to know all the things that New York City could mean. And I just
Interesting.
don't think there's other athletes like Reggie Jackson now who appreciate, kind of those perks of locality and location, right?
Well,
The
yeah.
old saying, location, location, location. It doesn't really
Yeah.
matter anymore because look, you and I can have a perfectly nice conversation. Now we can only have had, 20
Yeah.
years ago, even, I'm using running up our long distance phone bills. And now we're just doing it just as a matter of
It's
rote. So it's a different world.
I think you just unlocked something there. The social media did change it because if you think back to the '90s when cable TV kind of exploded and the internet kind of exploded, who was popular? The Yankees were emerging and the Cowboys, and they are
Yep.
probably the two dominant brands, right?
For sure. I mean, I
In
think there's
sports.
those, and you got the Dodgers now also, just because
Dodgers, yeah.
of success and just the international momentum they have now. So those three are kind of on their own island. But yeah, look, I mean, the Yankees logo. We'll probably talk about this a little bit about George too. The Yankees logo is one of the most recognizable logos in the world in any business, right?
Yeah.
You can go to London, you can go to Beirut, you can go to China, you can go anywhere, and somebody's gonna be wearing a Yankees cap in the street. I covered the Olympics in 2008 in Beijing, and there were hundreds of Yankees caps. I don't know if they even knew who the Yankees were, but they knew what the interlocking NY stood for,
Yeah.
and the Yankees have really fed off that. It's just less impactful now because they just don't have the financial might they used to. They make plenty of money, and I think whenever Hal Steinbrenner tries to say, well, it's not what it used to be, people misinterpret that as him crying poverty, which he's not.
Yeah.
But he's going up against the Dodgers. They literally have a bottomless pit of resources.
Mm.
The Blue Jays have a bottomless pit of resources, even in his own city. Steve Cohen, I mean, he's a one-man corporation, but he's worth 23, $24 billion.
Yeah.
Hal Steinbrenner can't light a candle to that. That's just a different kind of landscape that you're dealing with.
That's interesting because when I was in New York at the Bergen Record, the Yankees were on top of the world. They were dominating. You had the Jeter era. And it's interesting. It almost sounds like what you're saying in the book, maybe, is that not the Yankees are crying poor, but the mom and pop shops don't really work anymore. Because that just happened with the Lakers out here in LA.
You're seeing it with the Lakers. You're going to see it now just about every time a sports team goes up for bid. The
Mhm.
family in charge is going to make generational wealth that they wouldn't have been able to find just about any place else. And invariably, they're all going to sell for incredible amounts of money, no matter if your team is in Pittsburgh or Los Angeles or Pittsburgh, or wherever. It's just being the owner of a sports team is a no lose proposition at this moment in time. And it wasn't always that way. Look, when Steinbrenner bought the Yankees, he bought them at CBS sold them at a loss. It's the only baseball team since the early '50s that's been sold for a loss, and that's just because CBS wanted to specifically target a group that wasn't going to move them out of town. So they could have made a profit if they wanted to. I mean, it's a no lose proposition, which is why people still want to get into it because they know if they put in
Mhm.
their time and they just want to use it as a flipping asset, they can. But the people who are coming in are all monolithic corporations. And you're right, the mom and the pop. It's funny to think of the Yankees as a mom and pop shop, but that's really kind of what they are. They're a family
Interesting.
owned and operated business, and there's just fewer and fewer of those anymore.
Yeah. So if you had to rank the richest MLB owners, Steinbrenners aren't anywhere near the top, right?
No, I mean you got the Dodgers, obviously, although there's not one person you can say is the money behind that.
Yeah.
It's just that corporation out there. I mean, the Rogers company in Toronto is limitless. The Cubs are owned by Limitless.
Mm.
I mean, there's a lot more limitless franchise owners than there used to be. And in baseball, that matters still, at least for the next couple of months, while there's still a salary cap,
Oh
and
boy.
while there's still a league. We can have a whole separate conversation about what's coming, in 10 months or so. But it's for sure. Like I said, it's hard to think of the Yankees as a mom and pop shop, but it really kind of is when you consider they're still family owned,
Mhm.
and those are becoming rarer and rarer.
So your book, The Bosses of the Bronx, the endless drama of the Yankees under the House of Steinbrenner, that almost sounds like a Game of Thrones type House of Steinbrenner. Was there a
Sure.
parallel there at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the first person to actually refer to that as the House of Steinbrenner, but it's
Okay.
it's hard not to use it because it's just
Right.
such a, it's yeah, especially now because the team, it's 16 years since George died, and it's still in familiar control. I mean, Hal is still very much the boss. He's boss small b. George was boss big B. And yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the irony with all of this, right, is that when Steinbrenner bought the Yankees in 1973, a couple ironies. One, the Yankees had one foot out the door for New Jersey or elsewhere. I mean, there was
Oh,
talk of them maybe moving to New Orleans because Yankee Stadium was falling down. They didn't think it was tenable to have a ballpark in South Bronx anymore. And within 3 years, he turned them around. William Paley, who owned CBS, and that's the irony, is that Steinbrenner bought them from the kind of corporation we're talking about with the Dodgers now, and it was a total failure when they owned the Yankees. William Paley was famous for a lot of other things. He already knew he was going to. One of the lines in his obituary was going to be that on his watch the Yankees kind of fell apart, but he also didn't want it that they're going to be leaving New York. And so as a result, because Steinbrenner's group was able to guarantee they'd stay in New York, and not the group that Lehman Brothers offered about $5 million more. But
oh.
they made no bones about the fact that they were going to follow the Giants to the paradise of the Meadowlands and North Jersey. And Paley didn't want any part of that. And that's part of the reason why Steinbrenner was so appealing to him. And the rest is baseball history.
Yeah, and they have been a juggernaut through the years, but I remember as a kid in the '80s, the Yankees were terrible. I'll never forget a guy threw a no hitter and we lost,
Oh yeah,
and
Andy
my
Hopkins.
yeah, there it is, Andy Hall. Yeah, my buddies ridiculed me at school because they were all Orioles fans. I was in the DC area.
Sure.
When did you start to passionately, when you're digging into this book, like understand like, oh, geez, the Yankees became a juggernaut? Was it early '90s? Is that when it was?
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, I mean, I grew up on Long Island, so
Oh,
in my house. In my house, we didn't, we weren't forced to root one or the other. It wasn't until I went to high school that I was forced to pick a side, and I picked the wrong one, I guess, because I picked the Mets when I was in high school. But
oh
I
man.
was well, yeah, bad beat. I was well aware of the Yankees because you couldn't be. I mean, you could not be if you were a baseball fan in New York in those years. The Yankees were on the back page every day, every single day. I mean, January, February, it didn't matter. George Steinbrenner's mission was to have the Yankees in the news at least every day, and he'd at least get a sky bar, talking about some Steinbrenner saying something or other, inside the
Right.
paper, and that was why, you started to realize the Yankees were just different. The Giants would have their season, they'd be important, and then they'd go away in the off season. The Mets the same thing. Every other team would. The Yankees were year round, and going back and discovering the New York newspapers before I actually became a member of that newspaper corps. It's remarkable. I mean, look, the Bronx New Yankees of the '70s and into the '80s, it was a different world and it was a different life. And you had to have a relationship with Steinbrenner, either a good one, or a bad one. If you had a neutral one, you were lost because you weren't going to have a story. You weren't going to have a story for the back page, and you were going to be covering the Nets within a couple of weeks if you weren't
Oh.
producing. And so that's it was a high pressure situation, but that also made for some unbelievable reading, even archivally, where you go back and you just can't believe this. I think one of the things that some people have been saying when they read my book is that you just can't believe all this stuff is true. Where's the urban myth in here? There's got to be some, and there's really not. I mean, it seems it reads like urban mythology. It reads like almost urban fiction, but it's not. It all happened, and it was all crazy.
Yeah, it almost sounds like listening to you that in a way, is it fair to say Steinbrenner was the blueprint for Jerry Jones? And this guy who just happens to be president of the United States right now.
Well,
Just
I was going to,
I
yeah.
don't know if carnival barker is the right phrase, but I mean they just always saying stuff to just keep your name in the news.
Well, the president is the obvious blueprint. A,
Yeah.
because they were friends. B, because I mean Trump was always in George's box. They were friends. He followed every step that Steinbrenner made in terms of his public persona. Forget the politics. Just when you read some of the Steinbrenner quotes in the book, I mean you can in your voice, you can in your head, you can hear the voice, and if it's not Trump's voice, it's the cadence. He picked up
Ooh,
that cadence from Steinbrenner. And
wow.
he wanted to be that impactful person in New York and beyond. But New York was what mattered to him in that moment in the '80s. I mean, he wanted to be the king of New York. George was the king of New York in Trump's mind. He wanted to be like that. So he was definitely a model. I mean, I think Jerry Jones would like to be thought of as Steinbrenner 2.0, but he says a lot of silly things and crazy things, but because they've been so unsuccessful for 30 years, really, I mean, the downtime for Steinbrenner was when he was too involved and too impatient. That was the '80s when the Yankees won more games than anybody in baseball, but didn't win any championships because George would always, trade somebody. He would trade Fred McGriff. Ask Frank Costanza. He would trade Jay Buhner. He would do stuff like that, and they would never win a championship. And we're kind of in a 30-year stretch of Jerry Jones kind of channeling that version of Steinbrenner.
Yeah.
I think for Steinbrenner is that, in those years, he was cursed at when he came into the ballpark. You would go to Yankee Stadium. I mean, the day he was kicked out of baseball the second time, the entire ballpark starts chanting Steinbrenner sucks. And you know, 10 years later, 10 years later, he went to the same ballpark and they were yelling, "Thank you, boss! Thank you, boss!" They were chanting it.
Wow.
Winning is a great deodorizer. Steinbrenner discovered that, and Jerry Jones is still looking for the recipe.
That's crazy. Now, contrast that with Hal. It almost feels like a Jerry Jones situation where Jerry loves to be out there, and then the guy who's going to take over for him is Stephen Jones, a lot quieter, more behind the
Yeah,
scenes, doesn't say as many incendiary things. Is it almost like that kind of guy is being removed from society? It's just a different era.
it is a different era. Look, people are more careful now, Jason. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, Steinbrenner grew up in an era. I mean, the idea that there would be somebody with a phone who could take a picture of them. I mean, that was like on Mars, right? So he had people know, and people of that generation had no problem expressing themselves, had no problem being themselves, being characters, being flamboyant, being larger than life. That's why you have a guy like Steinbrenner. It's why you had a guy like Al Davis, one of George Steinbrenner's best friends. They were born on the same day, a year apart, July the 4th. That's why you got a guy like Jerry Jones. You're not going to get guys like that anymore because people are a lot more careful. Businessmen know that one misstep publicly, I mean, they could cost them $1 billion, could cost them everything. So they're going to be very careful. I think Hank, by nature, is careful. I think George definitely targeted him as the guy that he wanted to lead the family business forward. Hank, his older son, was a good man, very temperamentally similar to George, but I think he realized that wasn't necessarily what the Yankees were going to need going forward into the next century. And Hank really grew tired of that role anyway, and so he happily ceded all of that to Hal. Like Hal doesn't look at it as a burden. He calls it a privilege being a Steinbrenner, running the Yankees in his father's name. There's two stories that he told me, which I think completely signify the difference. One, what he says is, look, my dad was all about the back pages, and I'm more about back rooms. That's where I like to get things done. My father would get things done on the back pages, and I do them in the back rooms. And I think that's a very accurate self scouting report. The other one, which I laugh at, is because people always wonder, does he care? And I always laugh about people who think owners don't care. Right? We used to hear that with Dolan in New York, and
Mhm.
like anybody who spends that much of their own fortune, are going to care. Woody Johnson, right? I mean, if a team stinks, they want to harp on somebody. So why not go right to the top and rip the boss? And that's what Steinbrenner endured for a while. Um, but look, I mean, Howard cares, and he burns to win. He wants to have a title on his own watch. Technically, 2009 belonged to him, but his father was still living. But he says, look, the difference between us, I'll watch a Yankees game on my TV, and they'll lose a game in the ninth inning. I'll throw a shoe at the TV. My father would watch a Yankees game. They'd lose a game in the ninth inning. He'd throw a shoe at the TV. And then he'd pick up the phone and he'd call Joel Sherman or or Jack
Right.
Curry or John Heyman and say, "Guess what I just did? I just threw my shoe at the TV." And suddenly there'd be 3 days of back pages. Hal's never going to do that, much to the chagrin of many Yankees fans who wish they would. But I think people ask me all the time, "Why did you write the book?" And it's because people forget who George was, and that's sad because people should remember even the crazy, flamboyant, not so great stuff that George did. That made him interesting. It made him interesting enough to write a book about.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I totally
and
agree. Well, that's one thing fans don't get. It's like we want interesting. We need it. That's how you get
yeah,
books. That's how you get back pages. That's how you get podcasts. And
100%.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
everything. And I
But people have
wonder,
this
I mean,
people have this belief that if George was, because 5 game losing streak, they just had a 5 game losing streak, Jason,
yeah,
and the inbox gets filled up, and they say, what would George do if George was still alive? And I get that more now, of course, because now I'm kind of the town crier for Steinbrenner.
yeah,
And they say, well, what would George do? And I said, well, here's the thing. I get, of course, George would go nuts. He'd fire somebody. He'd trade somebody. He'd rip people. But he did that all through the 80s, and it didn't work.
didn't
I
work. Yeah.
mean, Yankees fans are so sad about the 17-year drought now, and nobody else is feeling sorry for them. But George Steinbrenner once had an 18-year World Series drought, doing things exactly
Mm.
the way Yankee fans want them done. They went from 1978 to 1996 without winning a World Series. So there's no magic bullet and there's no magic touch. But I think it's look. I mean, if you think that Hal doesn't want to add a 28th championship, you don't know Hal very well.
Well, what was the magic bullet to get them going in '96? From '96 to 2009, they won one, two, three, four, what, five?
Well, this is going to be,
Jeez.
yeah, now this is going to be sound funny from a guy who just wrote a book about the Steinbrenners. But actually, giving him like long extended vacations really was the best thing that ever happened to the Yankees. In the early 70s, when he first bought the team, he got suspended for 2 years, for getting involved in the Watergate situation with campaign contributions. He missed 74, 75. And in his absence, Gabe Paul built the champion. Acquired Mickey
Oh,
Rivers, acquired Chris Chambliss, acquired Greg Nettles, acquired uh, Willie Randolph, and that was the bones that won back-to-back championships. Later on, when he was suspended for basically blackmailing his best player, Dave Winfield, thanks to Howard
oh,
Spira.
jeez.
I mean, think about those. Just run those words back. He was blackmailing his best player. In his absence, Dick Michael wouldn't trade the core 4 plus 5. And I always said, laugh, poor Bernie. He gets left out because you couldn't find a good word to rhyme with 5, I guess. But you got the 4 plus Bernie, at least one of those guys, maybe 2 of those guys, if George had been in charge, would have been traded at the trade deadline,
Mhm.
sometime, in 1988 or 89, for fading Frank Tanana or somebody like that.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
Stick Michael refused to do that. And as a result, when George came back, he had a championship quality team. And then he
Mhm.
hired the right manager in Joe Torre and the right GM in Brian Cashman. And all of a sudden, you had champion after champion. And like I said, winning solves a lot of problems.
And so when you're trying to flip it and say, what the hell's wrong now? Why can't they win a World Series? Does it kind of come back to ownership again? This time, just not having, I don't know if the funds is the accurate word because they're rich as hell.
Look, I think a lot of Yankees fans would tell you that Hal needs to be a little less stable. That yes, okay, maybe even intellectually we can all say that it's better to be like that than to be the exact opposite, like his father was, and he keep hiring and rehiring the same guy 4 and 5 times. But I do think that I argue with them and say, Aaron Boone averages 94 wins a year. He doesn't hit a great deal of
Yeah.
postseason success. But ask a Met fan you might know, if they would sign up for 94 wins a year and a playoff appearance every year. That doesn't come with the sign-in fee. I mean, you have to actually earn that year after year. Brian Cashman and Aaron Boone, for the most part, deliver 94, 95 wins. Now, is that enough? Of course not, because Yankee fans have this silly notion they should win the championship every year. And why do they have that? Because George Steinbrenner put it in their heads.
Yeah.
And so that's also to me part of the fascinating legacy he's left behind is that he's been dead 16 years, but people always wonder what would George do because and what I say is, look, I think Aaron Boone will still be the manager, but he might be on his third trip through the system because, like Billy Martin, he might have been hired and fired a couple of times.
Right. Yeah, I do wonder if it's simply a situation where, hey, 26-ish teams would accept what the Yankees have done the last decade, but maybe
For sure.
27. I don't know. Maybe it's 29. I'm not sure. But the Yankees fans, like you said, they're just a little spoiled. I'm curious, in working on the book, researching it, how did this Steinbrenner family take it? Were they totally on board? Did they want to work with you? I
Yeah,
love
look,
that question.
yeah, no, look, it wasn't an authorized book by any means, but it wasn't a write around. Look, I mean, I've talked to Hal and Hank and George. I mean, just it was their voices were always going to be in it just because of the nature of my day job, which going back almost 30 years involves talking to George and talking to Hank and talking to Hal and talking to the Yankees and covering that team. But Hal was very good about giving me as much time as I needed to answer every question I had, every inquiry I had to kind of walk me through a couple of complicated issues with the Yankees and, make me understand it so I can make the readers understand it. So, like I said, I mean, it's not authorized in any sense, but they were very helpful. And, I make a point in the book in the acknowledgments to thank him, to thank Jason Zillow, the Yankees PR guy for so many years. Uh, without them, it would have been a lesser book because, you know, I had quotes from Hal anyway, but most of those quotes would have been assembled with other people through the years and
Yeah.
from past newspaper columns. So I was able to have fresh stuff in there, and it was by talking to him that I got that shoe at the TV anecdote. So that
Yeah.
was my favorite Hal anecdote in the book. So they were good about it.
I love it. So, Mike, I think for your next book, if assuming you don't already have a deal in place, we got to write about Woody Johnson, and this disaster that is my Jets. I don't even know where to start. They've been since Mark Sanchez and Rex Ryan. They've been the worst franchise in pro sports. I think they have the longest drought for a title. I don't know. Would you examine Woody Johnson, or is he better left
It's
unsaid?
No, you know what I mean, especially because I think it's funny. Jerry Eskenazi, longtime writer for the Times, who covered the Jets for many years, he wrote a book called Grand Gangrene. It was kind of a whimsical look at the Jets and their tortured history. But that was like written 30 years ago. It's 30. Think about how much torture has visited the Jets in the years since then. So there's certainly fertile material there. And there really hasn't, other than that book, there hasn't been a lot
Oh,
of Jets books because why would there be?
where's the
It's
fan base? Like you're going to
it's
sell globally, right? You're going to
right,
baseball fans who hate the Yankees are going to buy this thing.
right.
A lot of people like looked up to Steinbrenner. Nobody cares about the Jets. They're irrelevant. Maybe they need an owner who's going to throw a shoe at a TV and call you up and be like, "I listen. This is Aaron Glenn is a joke. We got to move on."
It's inexcusable that, well, both New York teams have been so bad, but at least the Giants have had a year here, a year there. It hasn't been they're the most feudal team in professional sports now. I mean, they have the title. I mean, the Sabres are in the playoffs now. I think the Sabres were a year behind them. That's it. Just the Jets. I mean,
Yeah.
it's been a decade and a half, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon. Do you?
No, definitely not this year. Maybe next year if they can get Arch Manning, or maybe he'll say
Yeah.
I don't want to play for them and they settle for the Notre Dame kid or something. But Mike Vaccaro, the book is "The Bosses of the Bronx: The Endless Drama of the Yankees Under the House of Steinbrenner." Mike, congrats, man! Great stuff, great career. Now we just gotta figure out the Jets.
Yeah, one of these days, Jason, we'll be talking about a book about the Jets. I'll make a promise to you on that. I might, I might need a hearing aid instead of these things because I'll be so old.
Wow.
But
Oh, damn!
let's get the let's.
Shots
I'm just,
fired. Yeah.
but I grew up a Jets fan, Jason, so I feel the pain. Believe me,
No, it's rough.
I'm not one of these haughty Giants fans who likes to make fun of Jets fans.
Yeah.
I know that if I'm making fun of Jets fans, I'm making fun of my own. So I
Yeah,
don't do that very often.
we're down there with like the Lions and the Browns, like
Yeah,
real the dregs of sports. All right, great
yeah.
stuff, Mike. Thanks a lot, buddy.
Jason, great seeing you again. Thanks for having me on. So good to talk to you.